Hey guys, my name's Khadroth, and today we're going to be talking to you about Kyokutei Bakin, aka our new AoE arts writer. Sorry. The issue here at play and why we're going to be going ahead and covering this is because we are going to be having Hakinden in early June. We already know this because the devs talked about it. It was part of their sort of revelations of things to come. And the issue at play here is that essentially this is going to be now roughly almost a month ahead of where JP was. And we kind of know why this is to an extent because we know that we're going to be getting obviously the anniversary on NA roughly about a month before JP had it. This is just always kind of the case as we usually end up celebrating it in early July, whereas JP normally ends up celebrating it early August or even late July at the earliest. Why they may be doing this year, we're not really sure. We actually didn't think they would be accelerating this much to try and get stuff out ahead of the anniversary, but that is why you guys currently have the Grail front going on right now in NA. So in an effort to stay ahead of the devs, because we don't really know why they're going this fast, we're just going to go ahead and kind of get you guys the Bakin and Tametomo reviews right now so that you guys know what you're up against. That being said, it is possible that we get the Hakinden event probably around June 3rd or 4th, roughly around when some of the other banners wrap up. But it is also possible that they actually just overlap with everything else and end up bringing it as early as June 1st. I don't really necessarily see that, but it is why we're going ahead and giving you guys the Bakin review. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and talk Bakin. Like I said, she's going to be our newest AoE arts writer being added to the game. Obviously, then, with that in mind, there's going to be some considerations for competition. You already have units out there like Da Vinci, like Odysseus, that are definitely SSRs as well that fill that same niche. But I think the other big sort of elephant in the room is going to be units like Khadroth that are welfare that everybody else has. We're going to be talking about that and comparing them. Also, Bakin is a limited servant. She hasn't had a whole lot of banners. Don't expect her to because this is sort of a one-off type of event. The Hakinden event is an event that we're going to be going over in the coming days. It is an interesting one. It's another sort of miniature lotto style of event, as we've talked about. And you will see yet another one after this event coming later this year with the Guda Guda event, sort of towards the end of the year. So it is an interesting event nonetheless, but Bakin is going to be sort of the banner unit for that. But we'll also be getting Tametomo as part of it as well. Now, Bakin is basically going to be a interesting concept for a writer because she can not only be sort of just your AoE looping writer, but she can also be used in sort of multiple damage dealer types of setups because she does have a little bit of utility in her kit. But regardless, let's go ahead and start out by looking at her raw stats. So right here, you guys can see she gets about 10.7k attack. This is actually pretty low for a 5-star. This is definitely a concern for her. But it's not the end of the world, as she does actually have quite a bit of damage scalability, particularly with regards to her NP. So if you're actually using her in niche, she'll actually do perfectly fine damage. If you're using her outside of that, that may be a little bit more of a concern. But at that point, that may be considerations for if you really want a stronger Bakin, just roll more copies of her. But obviously, I'm not necessarily going to recommend that for everybody. She does at least get about 14k HP. Again, this is not top of the line HP, but it is still fairly robust. And she does have some survivability in her kit in order to help this out. So I don't think the HP is going to be too big of a concern either. And now, as you look here, you can see she is man attribute. She has a little bit under average star absorption for a writer at 197. And that's just, again, because she's an arts unit. She has star generation of 9% and P-charge attack of only 0.41. This is, I think, a number that a lot of people look at and think that her refund is bad. Please don't pay any attention to anyone that thinks that. They have no idea how refund works because this is actually still going to be perfectly adequate for her. You guys can see here she does have NP charge defense of 3%, and she does end up having a death rate slightly higher than average at 33.7. She does end up being lawful balanced as well, and then is female gendered. Her basic traits here are going to be divinity, hominide, humanoid, riding, servant, 7 knights servant, and weak to inima elish. She, interestingly enough, does not come with a triple arts deck. This is probably due to the fact that she's a writer, but she ends up getting the second quick card. So As a result, she does at least have very good hit counts. Her Buster card is going to be the one that's underperforming at only 2, but her extra attack actually gets an extra 1 at 6. So at the end of the day, this is actually pretty ideal for her, as it does mean that her extra attack's performance is going to be pretty good. Also, considering the fact that it can generate stars and noble phantasm means that it's kind of putting the hit counts on the cards that are actually good for that, less so on the cards like Buster that are just more known for their damage. So again, it is a perfectly adequate allotment of hit counts there. Looking at her kit now, you guys can see her first skill starts out by charging her own gauge up to 30%. This is going to make her a 30% charger, just like Odysseus. Obviously, we're going to have some concerns about like comparisons to someone like Da Vinci Rider, who very much automates looping, both with the charge per turn that she gets, as well as the charge that she gives the entire party after NP. Bakin's not necessarily going to do that, but Bakin does at least charge the party by a flat amount of 10%. It is except herself, though, so this does not add into the 30% charge that she already had. She does gain 15 crit stars right here, basically giving her a nice crit star bomb. So even though she had that lesser amount of star generation, it's a-okay for her to basically still have this, as it's going to give her an ability to sort of produce stars on command, on demand when she actually needs it. This is going to be on a 6-turn cooldown. Her second skill here is quite the doozy of a skill. It's got a lot going on for it. You can see it's a targetable skill, so this is where some of the supportive aspect is going to come from, on top of that 10% charge that she's giving everybody else, as it's going to increase one ally's quick arts and buster performance for 3 turns by 20% each, and then basically increase their critical damage for 3 turns by an additional 20%, increase their NP damage for 3 turns by an additional 20%, recover their HP by up to 1,000, and then also grant them a single stack of evasion for 3 turns, as well as debuff immunity 1 time for 3 turns. This is sort of an all-in-one, all-encompassing type of skill. It pretty much does everything that you could ask for it. So in that regard, I do think it is a very nice effect. It's not super strong, and for most units, especially that focus on one card type, this is fundamentally a 40% steroid. It's going to be their card type up of 20%, as well as the NP damage up of 20%. But the fact that this can be used either on Bakin herself to help out her looping and damage output, or on somebody else after maybe Bakin takes out a wave and helps charge the party, does sort of lend credence to that idea of Bakin being versatile, being adaptable, and being usable in multiple party structures to allow you to really utilize her effectively. In other words, Bakin is going to be good and useful no matter what the circumstances are. And in that regard, I do find that she is going to be a very solid unit for most people to pick up. But keep in mind that there are other welfares out there that you just may already have, so Bakin is not necessarily going to be anything like a gotta roll. It's just going to be somebody that you might want to consider if you really like her design, or you really feel like she could add something to your Chaldea. All of this, again, still on a 6-turn cooldown, so cooldowns here being kept low, which is going to be really nice in terms of synergy with someone like Tamamo. Then we end up on the third skill here, and it's going to increase her own art's performance for 3 turns by up to 30%, and then basically grant herself a buff on attack for the next 3 turns that will increase the party's attack by 5% whenever Bakin uses an arts card. Now, the interesting concept at play is, again, if you remember, her deck is only double arts. If this had been triple arts for a deck instead, this might be a little bit nicer. But as a result, in a conventional 3-turn scenario, you're only going to end up getting 2 cards. Now, what you can do is you can card count and try to pop it towards the end if you realize that you're going to end up getting, say, both of Bakin's arts cards on turn 3. You could pop this skill, get the effect for that, and then maybe get more if you manage to land an arts card in the next 2 turns, as there is going to be that reset that conventionally happens every 3 turns with your cards. But at the end of the day, I can say if you manage to game the system that way, it's perfectly fine. You could also end up using her in a solo environment and use that to just keep spamming. That would then, at that point, get you quite a bit more. But remember, this whole benefit to this is it being a party-wide effect, so it just kind of is what it is. But this does sort of contribute some ideas of maybe pre-carding your NP to get more damage, not only for yourself, but maybe even for somebody else in the party trying to, fire off a Noble Phantasm. So either way, getting Bakin's Arts card out before the NP has some advantages, but obviously, just like any other conventional unit, you're probably going to want to do it after the NP for more refunds. So there is going to be that sort of cost benefit analysis you're going to have to do of, do I want more damage now on my NP, or do I want more damage afterwards, basically, maybe with a follow-up NP as well as getting more refunds. So again, up to you to determine how to use this skill, but it does sort of, again, make it quite versatile in its use. She does get a 6-turn cooldown as well on this, so everything just kind of nice and even across the board. For her passives, you can see she does get Riding B. Again, there you go. That's that second quick card being in there. So this is going to really help her out in that regard, as it's going to just increase the amount of Noble Phantasm generated as well as stars being generated by those cards. And then Magic Resistance B, this is going to increase her debuff resistance by 17.5%. Most units end up having magic resistance. This is just going to be a little bit something extra, but do keep in mind she does at least have that targetable debuff immunity in her kit, even though it's only one time. She does also get Divinity of C rank. This is going to add 150 flat damage to her attacks. Nothing too crazy, but certainly something better to have than not. And then we get to her Append skills. Starting off with her third Append here, you can see she does have anti-foreigner attack damage aptitude. There is potentially some synergy here, as again, she does have both anti-evil and anti-demonic niches. You never know, these might end up sort of coming into play, as a lot of foreigners are going to end up having that evil trait due to, literally the whole like foreign god type deal going on with them. But again, it's up to you to determine if this is something you actually wish to use your coins on. Bakin being a limited unit that doesn't have a lot of banners means that you probably don't need to really try too hard to grab this, though it wouldn't be the worst out of all the third Appends I've ever seen. For most people, I'm still going to recommend mana loading just because of the sort of strategies that this helps unlock, especially with her being a 30% charging unit. This means it's going to pair out really nicely with her charge skill if you manage to lower your mana loading. So this is going to be my recommendation for what you want to grab first on her. But certainly the first skill here is probably the second recommendation that I would go with, because again, this is going to increase her extra attack finesse. It's going to increase the performance of that 6-hit extra attack. That's not only going to be damage, but also star generation and NP generation. So you already know you have a good extra attack. Enhancing it even more is going to help you out quite a bit. Now, looking at her Noble Phantasm, you can see it is only a 4-hit AoE Arts NP, and this is where, again, some people are probably going to go, well, hold on, she only has a 0.41 NP gain rate. Why is this so crazy? Well, keep in mind, she has a targeted 20% arts up in her second skills kit there. And then her third skill is also a 30% arts up. So she really does have 50% arts up for 3 turns in her kit. At that point, you also know she has a charge skill. So this 0.41, especially with good hits on the arts cards, doesn't look too crazy, even though it's only a 4-hit on the NP. This is going to be an AoE MP that's going to increase her own damage against demonic enemies by 30% for 1 turn. This is a power mod, a power modifier. The reason why we know this is because it's got a 1-turn duration. This means that it's not only going to impact the NP itself, but it also can subsequently influence cards that she uses for the rest of that turn. So if you manage to follow up the NP with her arts cards, for instance, they would also get 30% extra damage towards demonic enemies. This is what makes power modifier really nice, as opposed to super effective modifier, which only impacts the NP. Not to misunderstand, though, because super effective modifier is not bad, and we'll explain that basically here in a second. So, again, you can see this deals damage to all enemies from there, and then it's going to also gain her 8 crit stars every time she NPs, so as she loops through, she will at least generate a little bit of crit stars. And then certainly the overcharge effect here is going to deal extra damage to all enemies that have evil alignment. It's going to be a 150% modifier here, making this super effective. Now, the reason why super effective is so strong is because even though it only impacts the NP itself, it is something that is a unique style of buff. That is to say, super effective modifiers are wholly unique and multiplicatively scaling with every other damage increasing buff in the game. because they are their own category. That's what makes super effective modifiers so strong, is it's not going to be additively scaling with other buffs. It's going to actually be multiplicative and sort of scale beyond its original capability in that regard. So super effective is always more desirable to have in that regard. Power modifier just opens up other possibilities for additional damage if you can manage to follow up. Again, both are good, but it just really depends on the situation. Bakin having both, it's the best of both worlds at that point, so this is really a feather in her cap to have this. Now, let's go ahead and talk about Bakin's overall refund numbers. As again, I think this is going to be important to understand about her so that you guys can understand why that 0.41 is not necessarily bad. So, with 2 times Castoria supports with Bakin against 3 caster enemies. This is going to be her effective sort of niche here. At this point that she's going to, with 3 out of 12 hits of overkill. So again, that's 1 hit of overkill per enemy if you're going up against 3 enemies. You're looking at basically, with that double Castoria setup, roughly 80% refund, and that's rounding up a little bit. It's actually 79.7, but that's just assuming that you actually killed the enemies in the wave and you got no additional overkill hits. With double Castoria against casters, you would get back to 80%. So again, the refund here is not bad. She's not a full 100% looper, but you already know she has charge in her kit, and you also already know that, again, there's going to be units like Castoria that have just charge for days to be able to provide to the actual unit trying to do the loop. Again, remember too that she can function in a multi-damage dealer setup. Maybe she just only needs to take out 1 wave herself. It really just depends on what you're trying to do. But if we're looking at that, we can also look at what about Bakin versus only 2 enemy casters with double Castoria. At that point, you would only need 1 out of 8. Only 1 to actually kill, basically, at that point. And one of the 2, basically. And that would get you back to the 50% breakpoint that should make it possible for most other things. So again, at 2 hits of overkill out of 8, you're only looking at like 53%, so it's not really making a huge deal. But this is enough to get you back to that 50% breakpoint that, systems like the quick system seem to rely on quite a bit. So in Bakin's case, yes, she can loop over even 2 enemy waves, and it's not that crazy for her to do so. And if we do want to analyze even a single caster at that point, a 1 out of 4 overkill hits would get you roughly about 26.57, aka 27% refund. Not the greatest, but it would be enough basically for her to actually be able to, get there as long as you had enough supplemental charge in the party. So at that point, yes, she can loop over even a single enemy. You're just probably going to need to start her out with some starting charge at that point and actually make sure you end up having something like an Oberon as a 3rd support so that you have enough to actually get back that sort of 70% on the back end. But it is what it is, and it is certainly a thing that would be possible for her, even though it might not be the most desirable of outcomes. So, as we look at that now, let's go ahead and talk about options for craft essences. Since we know looping is not really going to be a problem with Bakin and her refund is actually going to be quite good, we can take a look at Black Grail here, as it's just kind of the gold standard for increasing the amount of damage that you do. Again, Black Grail does not have to be the option that you use, though. There are other sort of lesser options that do similar effects to Black Grail, things like Heaven's Feel, Angel's Song, or Dragonkin. Each one of those should be one that you might have already and should be a decent replacement, if not going to be performing to the same degree that Black Grail does. Maybe you're up against one of those scenarios where it's like a 2 enemy wave. Maybe at that point you want to use something like Ocean Flyer, or maybe you're in a hybrid setup where Bakin's just handling 1 enemy. Either way, starting her out with a 50% starting charge CE is going to be ideal for that. That's where my recommendation for Ocean Flyer is coming in, since it's such a good welfare CE that you guys all should have. And again, it's all attack scaling and basically going to get you all the charge, NP damage up, and arts up that you would really want on her. If you manage to be in a scenario where you just really need to invuln pierce with her, Bakin doesn't have sure hit or invuln pierce anywhere in her kit. So the recommendation is going to be something like Honey Lake that can stack an additional power modifier should the enemy be burning. If you're concerned with that, remember you can just put burn command codes on Bakin's cards and then maybe, try to pre-card or something like that to get burn on the enemy. Certainly, this is going to be a tactic that's going to work a lot better in challenge environments necessarily than something like farming, but it is an option there should you need that invuln pierce. And there are other invuln pierce CEs that you can work, especially something like Origin Bullet, which is pretty much custom tailor-made at this point to work against casters. So that is going to end up being a more permanent viable option for some of you out there that just need that invuln pierce and would work perfectly for someone like Bakin, since you're already going to be using her against casters to begin with. If you're trying to start from zero, though, and you maybe somehow need just a little bit more refund, Sign of a Smiling Face can be your go-to, as it's going to still provide some NP gen as well as arts up, kind of helping out those refund numbers, but not quite being Black Grail at that point. And then if you're looking for a more welfare version of something like that, something like Royal Icing, not going to be too much, but it can give at least the 15% arts up that could potentially really help you out. So again, those are going to be my craft essence recommendations. You don't have to use these. You can still use something like Formal Craft or something like that if you're really just looking for some additional NP generation. But either way, all of these should be viable options for Bakin depending on the circumstances. Now let's go ahead and talk about the actual charge scenario with Bakin. This is going to be against 3 caster enemies with a double Castoria and Oberon setup. This is honest to God almost overkill at this point. As you can see, you don't even need the Append or any sort of starting charge. You're just going to go ahead and pop both Castorias all the way on turn 1, have them fire off the NP if you want right there, or you can go ahead as well and just give Oberon's 20% charge for some additional NP damage up on turn 1. Kind of, even though you're overkill on the amount of charge you already have, that's going to be plenty of firepower basically. And then she's going to fire off that NP, get back to about 80% refund there, and then have her charge to basically top that one off, fire off a second NP, and then have Oberon's 50% charge to do it. So it doesn't even have to be someone like Oberon. You could maybe perhaps get away with using someone like even Nero Bride, or again, maybe even someone like Helena, in order to actually get just that little bit extra more charge and sort of arts up. So you can get away with less. Oberon's just going to be the best damage solution, but certainly you don't have to utilize him. And now, kind of giving you guys some ideas for some other charge scenarios here that we worked out. You guys can see this is going to be something like a Castoria here with a Nero Bride, and basically someone like Proto Merlin down the line. As again, this is going to be another solution if you're trying to sort of mix and match, because maybe one of your supports is already Bond 15, or maybe you just don't want to use them, or maybe you don't have them. Either way, this would mean that you wouldn't have to take doubles of any sort of sort. And you can see right here, you start her out with the Append, basically give her the 50% charge from a Castoria, and then the 30% from Nero Bride. That's enough for the turn 1 NP. Basically, at that point, she refunds 87%, and then essentially you're going to end up getting something like Proto Merlin coming in here, providing the other 20%, and then that's going to be another 80%, and then Bakin's going to handle that sort of end amount. Again, this is going to be another Bakin against 3 times casters, and this is going to be any 30% charger here, basically, as the third support. So, obviously, the advantage of using someone like Proto Merlin is going to be the fact that she gets another arts up, but maybe you don't have that, and you can see how if you don't have that other arts up, the refund number drops to about 69%. So, as long as you had somebody that could provide an additional 30% charge to her, that would be enough for it to work. And then certainly this is going to be Bakin against 2 times casters, or again 3 times Zerkers. I didn't really go over those numbers with you, but it is something to nonetheless understand it will impact refund. So at this point, basically it's still the same sort of setup with double Castoria and Oberon, but basically you want to start out with the Append, utilize everything other than maybe one of the 20% skills from the Castoria, fire off that first NP. At that point, you're going to only refund against 2 enemies 43%, and then you're basically going to be looking at essentially Oberon there with basically his 20%, the other remaining Castoria 20%, and Bakin's 30%, bringing those numbers all the way up to 113% charge. And then for wave 3 at that point, since you've kind of gotten all the buffs on now she refunds that 53%, and boom, there you go. The missing Oberon 50% charge would be all you need to loop over it. Again, against a single caster enemy, you're looking at basically a similar type of setup here of needing to start out with a 50% CE, but still being able to do it. And again, I'm just not going to bother going over the finer details of each one of these, but you can kind of see how it works with that in mind. And even a scenario in which you use Bakin basically with double Castoria, and then something like instead Fragment of 2004 for some just, non-plug suit action here if you're trying to get away with sort of, less supports and actually just kind of have a nice, easy 3-turn loop. Again, each one of these is certainly possible. Just make sure you're sort of following the instructions. Now, with that in mind, let's go ahead and talk about Bakin's damage output. So this is going to be Bakin basically against sort of neutral numbers here, but it's going to be 2 times Castoria Oberon, a level 100 Black Grail, and Neo Plug Suit. You guys can see right here at NP1, the damage is not that great. Just keep in mind it is neutral, but you do end up having things like the demonic power mod of 30% and the anti-evil of 150%, that super effective modifier really helping spike the damage. And it is possible to have overlap where you manage to get both in play at the same time. Again, demonic and evil, that's like, 2 peas in a pod at that point. So you can expect that these will overlap from time to time. But then certainly if you start looking at the NP2 numbers, you start realizing that the numbers get a lot better. So if you're really concerned about damage, you can always try to get that second copy. But obviously, as long as you're using her within her niches, her damage should be very much adequate and very solid. But we do have that ability to compare against some of these other enemies. So we do have Santa Nemo, who is a more recent welfare on the JP side of things. And you can see him with double Castoria Oberon, a level 100 Black Grail Neo Plug Suit. You're looking at basically 346 for him, and then also anti-evil niche at 519. So that's going to cause someone like Bakin a little bit of, concern, certainly. And at that point, you're going to be definitely needing to consider things like her ability to double up, or maybe her utility for the rest of the party. Or again, possibly just rolling higher copies of her. You do obviously end up having another comparison, and that's going to be someone like Khadroth. Now, Khadroth is a lot more straightforward. There's no extra niche there, and Khadroth has other utilities. So to me, she's kind of this like baseline of you sort of need to have the capability of dealing more damage than her in some way, shape, or form. And thankfully, Bakin at least does have that. She can outscale her, particularly with the anti-evil niche here. But you are going to be at least somewhat concerned over her ability at NP1 outside of niche that basically Khadroth's going to just flat out be better. So at that point, you're going to have to worry about, again, do you roll that second copy or do you just not use her outside of the niche? And again, I'm going to say, don't forget about sort of her other supportive aspects that not only that Khadroth has, but obviously that Bakin has with that targetable second skill and that ability to charge the party. So keep that in mind that basically every single one of her skills has some sort of beneficial party-wide effect on it, and that you can use this to your advantage to make Bakin a little bit more useful. Now, let's go ahead and compare her to, again, some of the other 5 stars here. You can see Da Vinci at NP1 is still somewhat struggling at only 224 compared to someone like Bakin here at NP1 at 248. You kind of just go ahead and know that Da Vinci's main forte is sort of that automation, that ability to charge the party and not necessarily have to worry too much about the refund aspect. Da Vinci is certainly going to be solid in that regard, but definitely this is a concern for her, is her overall damage output. And again, you can see the damage does get a lot better at MP2, but yes, this is going to be something to obviously pay attention to. Odysseus is definitely better than Da Vinci in terms of his damage output, and he does have that ability to remove defensive buffs on his NP before his damage goes out. So he has that capability to kind of just pierce through just about everything, which is sort of the utility that he has, but he is permanent as well. So some of you guys may have him to a higher NP level or something. So just keeping that in mind, though, the fact that Bakin is coming out at 248 already, and he's at 243 without any sort of niche, does mean that that defensive removal is really his only selling point at this point. Though, to be fair, we kind of have already known that, as again, we've already had to contend with these sort of issues with the sort of addition of units like Khadroth and now, yes, even Santa Nemo. So again, I do think Bakin is still in a better spot than probably the other two for damage reasons, but not necessarily still when you consider some of the other aspects of what some of those welfares bring to the table. So, what do you guys feel about Bakin? How do you guys like, or will you be rolling during Hakinden? Or at that point, are you guys going to be saving basically for anniversary and summer upcoming? If you guys do plan to roll for Bakin, which Ascension form is going to end up being your favorite? I'm partial actually to the second one, but hey, you know, maybe you guys are preferring maybe the third or even the first if you're looking for something different. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. I will see you guys next for the Tametomo video. Again, thank you guys for all the support. Have a good one.